Welcome everybody to Brews and Views at the new time, and hopefully this is a more convenient time for everybody, and we'd be happy to entertain any input you have on timing of Brews and Views. I'm Chris Kontag, and I'm the director of the Institute for Quantitative Health Science and Engineering, and we started Brews and Views with the Center for Ethics in the Humanities and Life Sciences a few years ago. And we decided with this spring semester, we would do a three-part series on food. Is this food good? And this is the second in that three-part series. Don't worry if you missed the first one, they are standalone. And we will be doing the next one also on food and focusing on other aspects of good food. So we have some tremendous discussants and a wonderful moderator for today's session. So I'd like to introduce Bjorn Hamburger. He's a assistant professor in the Department of Biochemistry and Molecular Biology, and he'll be moderating the session today. Thanks, Bjorn, and I'm looking forward to an exciting and interesting session.
Thanks, Chris. I would like to introduce the other exciting persons who are joining us today. This is Kevin Elliott. He's professor at the Lyman Briggs College, Department of Fisheries and Wildlife, and the Department of Philosophy. And Felicia Wu, she is a distinguished professor in food safety, toxicology, and risk assessment at the Department of Food Science and Human Nutrition and the Department of Agricultural Food and Resource Economics. My name is Bjorn Hamburger. I'm assistant professor in biochemistry and molecular biology, and I'm super excited that we have a cool topic today that actually is very controversial, which is the value of GMOs. And with that, I would like to pass it on to Felicia, right? You're starting, huh?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much, Dr. Hamburger, for that nice introduction. I will share my screen now and hope that you can all see it. Make this into a slideshow. Okay. Thank you all for showing up this afternoon and this evening, wherever you may be around the world. My name is Felicia Wu, and I'm the John Hanna Professor of Food Safety, Toxicology, and Risk Assessment in Food Science and Human Nutrition and Agricultural Food and Resource Economics at MSU. Our title is, you will come to understand it over the course of the next several minutes, what we mean by from gold to weevil. And these actually do have some implications for what we are going to be discussing as far as the science and the ethics of genetically modified organisms. Now, first, I would like to couch GMOs in the broader picture of food biotechnology. So what are the ways that we apply biotechnology to food, generally speaking? I'll give you a brief overview of this so that you have a sense of when you go into the grocery store, for example, what might you be encountering that might have food biotechnology applied to it. Interestingly, genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, are among the oldest group of biotechnologies that we have applied to food. And these involve taking genes from particular species, and then we as humans insert them into other species, and these can include plants or animals, such that those plants or animals have particular traits that are desirable for the purposes of agriculture. Now, we have been planting GMOs in the United States ever since 1996. And it's only in roughly the last 5 to 7 years that a number of new food biotechnologies that do not involve this cross-species engineering have come into play. And there are some that we can even come into in our grocery stores. There are varieties of crops that use RNA interference technologies, or RNAi. For example, these are methods by which we can deliberately prevent RNA from producing, for example, toxins if we're attempting to act on a fungus that might otherwise infect a crop. There is now talk about lab-grown meat, and we're working to make this technology less expensive. And this is about taking a tissue sample from an animal, such as a cow, for example, a sample of blood, a sample of skin, and then extracting the stem cells, culturing them such that we're able to develop muscle meat, and that can be consumed, for example, in the form of a hamburger without having to kill any animals, without having to raise animals in concentrated animal feedlots. And then you've probably heard a lot about gene editing, which has applications across a variety of areas of biology, including food biotechnology. Gene editing involves using certain technologies, for example CRISPR-Cas9, by which we can deliberately edit the genes to have certain desirable outcomes in a particular species. Of note, right now, we have, for example, two varieties of gene-edited crops that are available. One is an anti-browning mushroom, and another is a variety of corn that produces higher levels of wax. It's of note that Doctors Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuelle Charpentier actually won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2020 for their work in developing CRISPR-Cas9 for gene editing purposes. So let's turn back to the very first of these. We're going to be focusing during this discussion on genetically modified organisms. So what are GMOs? These are organisms, and they can be plants, animals, bacteria, that contain genes that we humans inserted rather than those organisms acquiring those genes through conventional breeding methods, for example, pollination. And these transgenes can come from any species. They do not have to come from the host organism. For example, golden rice, which has been in stages of development ever since the late 1990s, originally it was modified with a gene from a daffodil and then it's inserted into the rice genome such that the rice is able to produce beta carotene, which is a precursor to vitamin A. Now, the more recently developed varieties of golden rice have genes taken from maize and then inserted into the rice genome. These inserted genes confer traits that the organism doesn't normally have, and these would include, for example, resistance to viruses or insect pests, tolerance to drought or freezing conditions, or new nutrients such as beta carotene. Now, where around the world are these GMOs being planted? What you see in this diagram from ISAAA from 2018 is where GMOs are being planted. And you can see that they're the countries that have some color. They're not the pale gray colors. We in the United States are by far the largest producers of GMOs around the world, followed by Brazil and then followed by Argentina. And you can see by the colors where GMOs are being produced in other parts of the world. Notably, the areas that are in the pale gray are areas that are not cultivating GMOs, and this includes much of Africa, much of the European Union, with the exception of Spain and Portugal, much of the Middle East, and Russia and former Soviet states. Now, in these countries around the world where we are producing GMOs, what are the types of GMOs that we are producing? Actually, they can be characterized into a small number of categories. We are planting a lot of herbicide-tolerant crops, and these include soybean, corn, canola, and sugar beet. And the idea behind herbicide-tolerant crops is the following, that weeds are a common problem in agricultural fields, but it can be very difficult to go by hand and to remove the weeds, either to spray on a herbicide in select spots or deliberately digging them out. So what herbicide-tolerant crops allow the farmers to do is that they're planting these varieties of herbicide-tolerant seeds. They can spray an entire field with herbicides using some sort of aerial spray or spray from a tractor. The weeds would be inactivated, but then the crops could still survive. So it's seen as being a way of saving labor and also costs for growers. There are also varieties of GM crops that produce their own pesticides, and these are typically the BT crops. These include BT corn, BT cotton, BT eggplant, and BT rice. And these are modified with genes from soil bacteria such that these crops are able to produce the insecticides basically in the crop plant, such that an insect attempts to chew on it and it is inactivated or killed. There are as well varieties of virus-resistant papaya and squash. The amphora or starchy potato, which is one of the main types of genetically modified crops that is allowed for cultivation in the European Union. Interestingly, it's not for human consumption, it's to be able to produce cardboard. And also the innate potato, which is slow browning and does not produce acrylamide when heated to high temperatures. So among these varieties of genetically modified crops that we have available in the world, first, are there any health benefits from current or soon possibly to be cultivated GMOs? Yes, there are some. Some of the work in my own research team examines the impact of genetically modified Bt corn in terms of reducing mycotoxins or fungal toxins. I mentioned in the previous slide that Bt crops are protected against insect damage. And if you've ever farmed yourself, or if you've ever had a garden, you might notice that wherever there is insect damage on your crops, like your tomato, for example, oftentimes there's a ring of fungus around where that insect damage is. And sometimes these fungi are actually producing toxins that are harmful to human health as well. And that is the case, unfortunately, with many of the fungi that colonize corn. In particular, there is one mycotoxin called aflatoxin that has been known for over 60 years to cause liver cancer in humans. And one of our recently published studies showed that transgenic Bt corn actually has lower levels of aflatoxin in the United States. And we haven't done this type of analysis in other parts of the world yet. As well, there is a variety, there is a genetically modified crop known as golden rice that was first cultivated in 1999. It's been approved for consumption by a variety of different governments around the world, not yet for cultivation, hopefully soon. And this is, as I had mentioned earlier, a variety that produces beta carotene, the precursor to vitamin A. It's intended for populations around the world that tend to be more vitamin A deficient because their diets do not contain high levels of preformed vitamin A, for example, in chicken livers or beef livers, and also not a lot of the vegetables that contain beta carotene, like carrots, pumpkins, squash, mango, or leafy green vegetables. The innate potato reduces acrylamide production if potatoes are fried or baked. So we like to eat it in terms of fries and hash browns, for example. What you may know is that when certain starches, including in bread or in potatoes, are heated to very high temperatures through deep frying or baking, then there is the production of a compound called acrylamide that is classified as a probable human carcinogen. The innate potato has lower levels of acrylamide when heated to high temperatures. Then there's also the SDA soybean that produces a higher amount of stearidonic acid. And our bodies convert that to omega-3 fatty acids, which has benefits in terms of reducing inflammation with implications for the prevention of many types of diseases, as well as having some brain benefits. Now, in the United States, how are the risks of GMOs assessed? We assess the ecological risks as well as the human health risks. And I'll go into a little bit more detail with a focus on the United States. I know we have participants from other parts of the world, and I think that there are some similarities in how risks are assessed in other parts of the world as well. In the US, there are 3 agencies that are responsible for the regulation of biotechnology. These are the US Department of Agriculture, which checks to make sure that the GMOs are safe for agricultural production as well as for the environment. The Food and Drug Administration, which undergoes a voluntary consultation process with industry to determine that the GMOs is safe for use in human food as well as animal feed. And the US Environmental Protection Agency, which specifically has regulatory oversight over those crops that produce pesticides. And so this includes all of the Bt crops, to determine whether this particular GMO is safe for the environment as well as for human health. Now, what is one category of human health risks that are evaluated for GMOs? Anytime you introduce a novel gene into an organism, that gene is producing a protein. Most of what we're allergic to in our environments and our food are proteins. And particularly in the United States, since GMOs are not labeled, there's the concern that you might be consuming something and you don't know whether you might be allergic to it. So the Codex Alimentarius of the United Nations developed guidelines by which we can assess whether GMOs might cause allergic reactions. First, what is the source of the gene? Ideally, we would come up with a source of the gene, whether from a bacterium or from another plant or some other species that is not known to be allergenic. For example, we don't want to take genes from peanuts because many people around the world are allergic to peanuts. Second, what is the similarity in amino acid sequence between this transgenic protein and proteins that are known to cause allergies? We have a data bank of the sequence, the homology, the sequence of different allergens. And we want to make sure that there's not a lot of homology between these new GM proteins and those allergens. Also, the GM foods are put into a simulated gastric acid meant to simulate our own guts. And ideally, we would digest these proteins within 2 minutes. But if it's still stable after 60 minutes, there's an increased risk that there could be allergic reactions. And then also tests in samples of serum. If you apply this particular a protein from a GMO to serum, does that increase IgE levels? That's a particular immunoglobulin E is increased in the presence of an allergen. And if it clears these particular tests, then there's probably not much risk of allergenicity to humans. Also, the compositional analysis is studied. So now looking at issues of genetically modified foods versus their conventional varieties, such as GM corn versus conventional corn, are they substantially equivalent in terms of basic macronutrients like protein, fat, and carbohydrate content, as well as the micronutrients, as well as fiber and fatty acids? And in addition, ecological risks are assessed for a variety of different animal species in both the water and on land, as well as in the air. Oops, okay, there we go. No, so that is some background on what GMOs are and how their risks are assessed in the United States. Now we'll go into a case study of 3 groups of GMOs that Dr. Kevin Elliott and I will be discussing. And we're going to be discussing 2 groups of crops that have been planted since the 1990s around the world. Those are BT crops and herbicide-tolerant crops, as well as one that has not yet been cultivated around the world for commercial production, and that is golden rice. In each of these cases, I'll be discussing the benefits to different stakeholder groups, particularly farmers and consumers, some potential risks, and some items for consideration. So first, I would like to focus on BT corn. What is it? It is the second most commonly planted transgenic crop in the world today. BT stands for Bacillus thuringiensis, which is a soil bacterium that produces proteins that are toxic to certain insect pests, but are harmless to other species. When these genes from the soil bacteria, from Bacillus thuringiensis, are then inserted into the genome of corn, this BT corn can then produce its own pesticide, sometimes in the kernels, sometimes in the roots, depending on the insect pest that's being targeted. And it's contained within the plant, so it's not being spread throughout the cornfield. Today, to give you an idea of how much we are planting of BT corn, 83% of the field corn produced in the United States is BT corn. Now, what are the benefits and the risks of BT corn? I've put the benefits in green and the risks in red. The benefits to farmers are quite obvious. BT corn has resulted in improved yield, so improved economic profits, reduced use of topical pesticides, and this is very important because prior to the introduction of BT corn, farmers were spraying on certain pesticides to control for European corn borer and corn earworm and fall armyworm, some of which were extremely toxic, including chlorpyrifos, which you may have heard of in the news in the last several years because it was found to be highly neurotoxic to children. Reduced levels of mycotoxins, as I discussed earlier, because there's less insect damage, there's less fungal infection, and there's less mold and less of the toxins that the molds produce. And also climate-related protections. And this is something that my research team is working on right now. For example, the varieties of BT corn that help to protect the roots of the corn. That actually helps to reduce the problems associated with drought, interestingly enough, because the roots are able to thrive and gather water. You don't need to irrigate as much. And that helps to reduce some of the problems of sinking water tables and drought-prone areas related to climate change in the future. There are also benefits to consumers in terms of the reduced mycotoxins in the corn products. But there are some risks to consider as well. The risks to farmers. Insects, particularly the corn rootworm, are evolving resistance to BT corn. And then are we getting onto the idea of a technology treadmill that we have to keep on coming up with new technologies in order to control the corn rootworm and other pests that may evolve resistance, like the corn earworm or fall armyworm? There are also potential risks to the ecosystem. There's the issue of gene flow, that we can't really control where the pollen of the corn is spreading. And what that could easily mean is that the pollen could spread to a cornfield that is not planting GM crops. For example, an organic cornfield. You may, at least in the United States, organic food is not permitted to contain any GM content, or it has a limit like 5% or something like that. But if you have Bt corn pollen flowing into that field, then that would be very hard to control. Also, what are the potential risks to non-target insects? The proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences determined in a series of papers in 2001 that there did not appear to be non-target insect impacts, for example, to other lepidopteran species like the monarch butterfly or green lacewing butterflies. But that is something that's still worthwhile to explore and to make sure that this is not truly a risk. Now let's move on to herbicide-tolerant crops, particularly those that are tolerant to the herbicide glyphosate. You may have heard of these as Roundup-ready crops. Now, what are the benefits and risks in these cases? Earlier, I explained what the benefits to the farmers were, that because they could easily spray the glyphosate all over the field, there are reduced labor costs and also less intensity in terms of having to have people on tractors and deliberately focusing on spraying particular weeds in the field. There is improved weed control, and then also increased yields. To the ecosystem, a purported benefit is that glyphosate is considered to be more ecologically friendly as a herbicide compared with its alternatives, such as atrazine, acetochlor, and metolachlor that are commonly used as substitutes for glyphosate. And some of these, particularly acetochlor and metolachlor, can be very toxic to particular species in the environment. Now let's take a look at some of the risks. Risks to the farmers include the increased risk of super weeds evolving. These are weeds that have evolved resistance to glyphosate. And once you have a super weed, there could also be the risk that there could be cross resistance to other herbicides then. Also, are there health risks associated with glyphosate? This has been a topic of intense scrutiny and debate over the last 6 years, following a classification by the International Agency for Research on Cancer of glyphosate as a group 2A probable human carcinogen. There's conflicting evidence though, and that's something that we can discuss later. And then finally, to the ecosystem, there's the overall larger burden of herbicides in the environment, because even if glyphosate is indeed more eco-friendly than atrazine and other herbicides, the farmers are spraying it over the entire field as opposed to just on individual weeds. And so there's going to be a lot more of the herbicide in the environment. And what are the implications of that? Finally, golden rice. And here I'd like to point out that we're very fortunate to have as one of our audience members, the project manager of golden rice in the audience, Dr. Adrian Dubac. So he can correct me if I get anything wrong here. Golden rice was first created in 1999 by Drs. Ingo Petraikas and Peter Bayer to provide beta carotene through a staple in the diets of many people around the world, rice, with beta carotene that our bodies can then biotransform to vitamin A. And this is particularly important in vitamin A deficient populations around the world, where rice is commonly consumed as a staple. And this is true of many parts of South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, and some countries in Africa. Why is this important? Because vitamin A deficiency can cause a variety of harmful health effects, including blindness, which you've probably heard about. We often hear we need to eat carrots in order to improve our vision, hearing loss, increased risk of infectious and diarrheal diseases, and finally, increased mortality risk in children and pregnant women if they are severely deficient in vitamin A. To give you an idea of the scope of the problem, there are just under 30% of children around the world under age 5 who are suffering from vitamin A deficiency. And this amounts to about 197 million children under age 5 around the world. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are multiple nations, including the United States, that have approved golden rice for human consumption. There is no human health risk, but no nation has yet approved golden rice for cultivation, so it doesn't make any difference. The environmental and health concerns have been addressed and have been submitted to various governments for approval, and it's in a bit of a holding pattern right now. Now, the issue with golden rice is that it's not sort of like within the purview of biotech. The Golden Rice Humanitarian Board has an agreement with Syngenta, a biotechnology company, such that the technology is provided for free, and the cost to consumers is the same as that of conventional rice. So to summarize, are GMOs golden or are they Weevil? They are actually, in fact, both. There is the golden rice and BT crops control for weevils, among other things. But more to the point, we can't generalize across all GMOs. Each individual GM crop has different benefits and risks to farmers, human health, and the environment. Golden rice and BT crops are likely to have net benefits. For herbicide-tolerant crops, what we've seen, especially in the last 5 years, is that there are emerging problems. So it's something that we need to consider further. And guiding future GMOs, their cultivation as well as their regulation, we need to consider not just the immediate benefits and risks, but also the long-term effects. In other words, thinking sustainably about the problem. With that, I'm all finished. Thank you for your time. And now we will turn to Dr. Kevin Elliott.
Thanks so much, Dr. Wu. This was a fantastic overview, and we're looking forward to hear the other side from Dr. Elliott.
All right, fantastic. So hopefully you can all hear me okay. Let me get my presentation set here. So yeah, it was a real treat to get to hear Dr. Wu's presentation. I learned some useful things there, so thank you so much. We're kind of thinking of my role a little bit as, Dr. Wu did a really nice job of presenting the science and getting us started thinking about some of the benefits and risks. And so I want to extend that consideration of benefits and risks to think kind of broadly about some of the social and ethical considerations related to GM crops. So I first want to just note that in principle, as we're thinking about these ethical issues, all else being equal, if there aren't problems, it seems like it's a good thing to be doing things to make farmers work easier, developing crops that can withstand diseases and harsh conditions, developing crops like golden rice that would have greater nutrient and like we heard with the BT crops, lessening the use of particular pesticides, or in principle, developing crops that wouldn't need as much fertilizer or irrigation, and increasing yields. So these are all really good things. And so what I want to consider on the next slide is why, in some cases, though, one might still have worries about particular applications of some GM crops. So I want to kind of give a list of the range of issues that to kind of launch our discussion with all of you, hopefully in a few minutes. So one, as Dr. Wu noted, people will worry sometimes about potential health effects. As she noted, we've got good testing in place to try to prevent this. I really enjoyed her presentation about ways of trying to avoid allergens in GM crops. But anytime you're even doing traditional crop breeding, and altering the genome of crops, and then people worry about environmental effects. And she did a really nice job, Dr. Wu, of highlighting the worry about super weeds, say, from glyphosate-resistant crops, or as we develop other GM crops that are resistant, the worries that the weeds can become resistant. The worries about super pests, say, as they develop resistance to the BT being expressed in BT crops. And as she noted, the potential for non-target effects. So the worries that, say, if you're expressing the BT in these crops, that, say the monarch butterflies could be affected. It appears that that isn't a problem in this case, but those are the kinds of things that we need to keep an eye out for. Then another issue that I'd like to bring up is the issue of the economic effects. And here I want to tie this in with my next point, which is a lot of folks will say we need to think carefully about how well particular GM crops fit in the overall social and economic. So it could be that something like a BT corn could be really valuable for farmers, say, in the American Midwest, but say, BT corn or BT cotton or something like that in a different context with, say, smallholder farmers in Africa, it might not work as well for them. So they might not as easily be able to get a hold of the credit to be able to purchase these more expensive seeds because they're patented, whereas they might in the past have just been reusing seeds. Or it could be that the new, say, BT cotton might not have all the characteristics that they've been used to in the past with the cotton they were growing. It might not be as ideally adapted to their conditions, or it might not have the precise qualities that have been useful to them. So we need to think about how these fit in particular contexts. Another worry that people raise is that a lot of folks argue that we need to be moving our agricultural system in different directions that are less energy intensive, that use fewer fertilizers, pesticides, irrigation, maybe that are less monoculture based in order to be more environmentally friendly. And people will worry that we have too much control by big companies that are developing a limited number of seeds and diminishing the kind of seed biodiversity we would have had around the world in the past. And so people will say, to the extent that we're emphasizing GM crops, that's sort of fitting into this current agricultural system, moving it forward, and we really need to develop some alternatives to it. Another potential worry, and I raise this because you might say, how could anybody be worried about something like golden rice? It just seems fantastic as long as the tests have been done to make sure it's not. Well, I'm not saying that this is necessarily a compelling objection, but one that some people will raise is that we have to be careful not to assume that technological fixes are always the idea of a techno fix has kind of a negative connotation to some folks, where they would say there are a variety of ways of framing a problem like vitamin A deficiency. And they would say, you could frame it as an issue of poverty, where we need to address the fact that people don't have the money to be, say, getting the green leafy vegetables or other food products that would get them the vitamin A they need. And so trying to address this problem with a technical fix like golden rice, some people might say that kind of takes away from other potential solutions. And there might be cultural reasons why people in some contexts might not find golden rice as appealing. And so again, this isn't a devastating problem, but it's something that we can discuss further. And I'm really glad that we've got an expert to kind of further our discussion of that. And again, some people will raise what you might call as Trojan horse kinds of concerns about some GMOs, where they might say that in general, they think that for economic reasons or cultural reasons, that a number of GM crops might not be ideal in some contexts, like for smallholder farmers in other parts of the world. And they might say, well, even if golden rice is kind of a unique, really positive case, they might worry that this good use could help to justify it, gets people sympathetic to GM crops, maybe gets farmers to stop their previous practices of reusing seeds and switch to getting them from an outside source. And that will then move them down this path toward other GMOs that aren't really ideal for farmers in these contexts. And of course, this comes from the idea of the Trojan horse that you're probably all familiar with from the Iliad, the idea that the Greek soldiers, gave this gift of this horse to the city of Troy, and they took the horse inside, and then the Greek soldiers were hiding, and they came out of the horse and were then able to attack the city. And so the idea is, an otherwise, good thing like this gift of the horse or like a GMO might end up leading to problems down the road with other GMOs that wouldn't be as beneficial. And then also, some folks would be worried that there's just something fundamentally problematic about engaging in genetic engineering, that this is a sort of hubris, that we're messing around with nature in ways that's get us in trouble. While in principle, you might say, yeah, that doesn't sound very compelling. As Dr. Wu was talking about the worries about like the pesticide treadmills and so on, I think some people would say, see, when you start doing such aggressive mucking around, changing things, you can get yourself in sort of an endless treadmill of having to keep fixing problems that we raise. So that's the kind of worry that some folks might raise. So let me just have a couple slides with kind of some general reflections for us to think about that can hopefully then lead into some. So first, Dr. Wu did such a nice job of addressing each of these three cases. I'm not going to really spend a lot of time on them, but just some big picture thoughts with the herbicide tolerant crops. Again, this can be really nice for farmers. It can make their lives easier. But as she noted, it creates this worry about a treadmill where weeds start becoming resistant, and then you have to start using other herbicides and potentially nastier ones, and so on. And she already discussed the issues related to glyphosate. Insecticidal crops like BT, this seems like a more promising case where, Dr. Wu noted health benefits and environmental benefits. I would just note that here, this could be an example where we could think more about the economic effects and the fit with particular social contexts and the fit with industrial approaches to agriculture. So again, I think it could be a valuable case to think about different contexts around the world, depending on what the farmers are facing, how much access to credit they have, how beneficial it is economically for them to be able to avoid using their normal pesticides and so on, versus the cost of the seeds. And then finally, with golden rice, this seems like a particularly beneficial. And the economic concerns one might have for some less well-off farmers, the companies are not, demanding their normal royalties that they would. And so if you wanted to try to raise concerns, I think the kinds of criticisms people will raise are just those about, is this the best fix or solution for issues of vitamin A deficiency in various contexts around the world? And could this get farmers down the path toward using GM crops that you may not think it's going to be as beneficial in some of those other contexts? But again, there's an awful lot of good to be said about golden rice. And then just some last points. I agree with Dr. Wu that it's really helpful to consider strengths and weaknesses of GM crops on a case-by-case basis. You wouldn't have to. You might think that there's something just in principle about this kind of technology that has worries associated with it. But I'm more sympathetic to the idea that we need the strengths and weaknesses in particular cases. And then I think it's also worth considering, some of these worries that I raised about the economics, about the fit with particular contexts. Could there be ways of kind of disentangling GMOs from those worries? So for example, I've been emphasizing concerns for smallholder farmers in different parts of the world. You might think that if they could have greater influence over the development process, well, then we might be more likely to use this technology in ways that are maximally beneficial to them. And so we might think about sort of how the development process operates and to what extent the affected stakeholders get to influence what, how the process of development of new crops plays out. And we have to think about intellectual property policies, sort of how to set that up. Again, golden rice, part of what makes it really appealing is the fact that it's not going to be more expensive than other crops. And a last point is that we have to remember as we think about the pros and cons of these crops that the real world isn't always ideal. And I think this can generate both positives of GM crops and negatives. So when I was raising the objection about, is golden rice a techno fix that takes away from really addressing these social issues people are facing, I think a reasonable response from the proponents of golden rice is, yeah, it would be great to address poverty so everybody can just purchase leafy green vegetables, but that's tough to do in the near future. And so sometimes these techno fixes are the best thing we can do, perhaps. So that's a positive. On the negative side, often when we're doing assessments of how well GM crops are going to work, how much it's going to help farmers financially, whether it's going to be environmentally safe, those assessments may not reflect the messiness of real world conditions. And perhaps, one of the more interesting examples is with BT crops. in order to prevent insects from becoming resistant, it's standard that one expects farmers to plant sort of refuges of non-BT crops so that the insects don't end up becoming resistant. And in some contexts around the world, either farmers may not be likely to do that, or back to these smallholder farmers, they may have so many different plots so close together with different farmers that it's really difficult for them to plant those kinds of refuges successfully. So we just have to consider the messiness of different contexts that our assessments may not always play out as we expect. So I think I'll stop there, and hopefully that gives a little ammunition for everybody to kind of consider pros and cons. And I'll turn it back over to Dr. Hamburger.
Elliot, fantastic. I really enjoyed you shedding light on some of those concerns. That provided excellent, I hope, ammunition for a really good discussion. But there were two comments in the chat. Dr. Douches said, I believe in response to your comment on playing God, I think we all are. And Dr. Kontag commented on the Trojan horse analogy and questions whether it is possibly falsely negative with a view on the GMOs, which are at least supposedly with a very beneficial impact on mind. I wonder if one of you wants to comment on that.
I'd be happy to comment on the Trojan horse analogy, unless you want to, Dr. Wu. I guess since I raised it, maybe it's appropriate for me to comment. And is my sound okay? I see now in the chat that people were having trouble hearing me initially. Is it better now? It's okay. Okay. I apologize for that. It was hard for me to check the chat while I was talking. So, yeah, I think you make a good point that it could be somewhat unfair, that detail of the analogy. This is something that critics have raised. So I want to be clear that I'm not necessarily advocating all these potential worries. But I think the thought would be maybe even if the intention isn't the same, I think the folks that push this kind of analogy are just saying that something that seems good could kind of hide something bad or lead to something bad. And so the idea would be for the people who really think that in some of these other contexts around the world, the GM crops aren't so helpful for the farmers, the idea would be, golden rice may be the best, most ideal case, but, could you use that to then sort of as the sneaky way to get the farmers started down this GM path that other cases of GM crops aren't going to be so beneficial for them. I think that's how those critics would try to make that argument.
If I may comment briefly on, I believe it was Dr. Douches who brought up, or no, it was first Dr. Elliott and then Dr. Douches responding to the point about playing God. I always get a little bit leery when I hear somebody making that argument. And the reason is that this argument of playing God has been used against Galileo, against Copernicus, against Johannes Kepler, against birth control, against so many different types, even hybrid crops. We're planting hybrid crops all over the world now, and that was considered to be playing God because you were taking a Mexican variety of corn and mating it with Nebraskan corn. and people saw this as objectionable in the past. So when that argument about playing God is ever raised, not only do I think none of us can read God's mind and not everybody believes in God, I tend to put that in a different category of arguments.
Yeah, so, I think that's fair. And I'm probably not the ideal person to defend that argument because, I'm also not super sympathetic to it. That's why I push more toward evaluating on a case-by-case basis. And for the kinds of reasons you make, Dr. Wu, that, we're constantly changing and altering the world in all sorts of ways. And so it's very hard to say when that becomes problematic. But it is worth us, I think, just recognizing that some folks have that kind of worry about too aggressively changing nature in some cases, because that could be a reason why some folks would say, we just don't feel comfortable with GMOs at all. Whereas I think we're on sort of the same page of saying, well, we need to look at the details of different cases to really decide. I appreciate your points.
Excellent point made. Yes, I would like to start off asking both of you about the use of the BT corn and maybe a comparison of the BT corn and organic practices where the spraying of the BT bacteria is actually perfectly fine, which yields a much higher load of the bacterial protein and at much less control. Would any of you like to comment on that?
I would be happy to do that. And Dr. Elliott, if you would like to add anything, please feel free. That's right, Dr. Hamburger. Microbial BT sprays have been approved for use in the United States ever since 1961. To give the audience a context of what these microbial BT sprays are, it was actually recognized in the 1930s that Bacillus thuringiensis, this soil bacterium, had pest protective properties. And so there was a way to gather these bacteria and to include them in a spray that acted like a natural pesticide that farmers could then spray on their crops. And in fact, if you look at the approved list of pesticides for organic farmers in the United States, microbial BT sprays is one of them. And we have had them now for 60 years. And indeed, this is somewhat less controlled because the spray has to occur exactly at the right time that the European corn borer, corn earworm, or fall armyworm is emerging in its larval stage in the field. And that's not always the case. So sometimes you have to go back and spray even more. So there is a fairly large load of the BT in the environment, but in fact, and its associated toxins, but it is a soil bacterium. So it's not expected that there is any harm to human health or the environment from the use of microbial BT sprays. Dr. Hamburger, I wonder if what you're getting at is, well, if the one is okay in organic farming, why is the other not considered to be okay? I think that a lot of it has to do with this whole notion of the means versus the ends. And that gets to something that Dr. Contag was bringing up earlier in his comment. Do the means justify the ends? I think that there are some that look at the use of biotechnology at all, and they say, well, we don't want this practice, regardless of what the end effect is. And I think that that's where Dr. Elliott and I agree. We really need to consider it on a case-by-case basis and not paint GMOs overall with either a broad negative brush or a broad positive brush.
Fantastic, thank you. My concern beyond what you had just pointed out was as well the development of resistance. Would spraying of large amounts of BT, microbial BT, lead to an increase in resistance in comparison to the very tissue-specific expression of a single protein in maize? Is this a concern?
Kevin, do you want to take that, or shall I?
I think that's a much better question for you, Dr. Wu. Go for it.
Right. I should point out that for the different varieties of BT corn, different insects are evolving different rates of resistance. Mm-hmm. So for a little bit of context, when we do not want insect pests to destroy corn, we do not want them to destroy the individual kernels because that reduces yield and that also increases the risk of fungal infection. But at the same time, we also don't want them to destroy the roots, which the corn rootworm does, because that can create lodging and all kinds of other productivity problems. The microbial BT sprays cannot do a lot about controlling the corn rootworm larvae, because it doesn't necessarily penetrate down. It is in fact the corn rootworm that has evolved the most resistance to BT corn. And that is not, that's not likely to be as a result of microbial BT sprays. With respect to the evolution of the European corn borer, corn earworm, and fall armyworm, there is some evidence of corn earworm and fall armyworm having evolved resistance to the crystal proteins in BT corn. I do believe, and I would be happy to hear from somebody else in the audience, or Dr. Elliott, or you, Dr. Hamburger, if you have ideas, I do believe that the microbial BT sprays have less of a role in the resistance because they are not embedded in the corn kernels. They are just being sprayed over the surface. And so it biodegrades very quickly in the environment. It's not contained and protected within the kernels, and hence contributing to selection pressure that can lead to the insects evolving resistance.
Okay, I see. No, I was really asking out of pure curiosity. Thank you. Now, if we want to move ahead from the BT, it looks like the glyphosate herbicide resistance GMO, that the GMO on its own does not seem to be the main concern, but the massive use of glyphosate. Dr. Elliott, do you want to maybe comment on that? Because I think that was highlighted in your concerns.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and again, I'm happy to hear more of Dr. Wu's thoughts on that as well. But I mean, I think that in that case, one really has to be weighing the consideration of the benefits to the farmers of, you know, it being much more convenient, with the concern, and this in some ways ties in with my point about industrial agriculture, that if one's kind of already worried about the fact that we're using a lot of these herbicides and that, you know, we may develop resistance to them, and then we you know, may not be able to develop additional herbicides that are as safe. I think I really like Dr. Wu's point that, you know, glyphosate, even if it may have some health effects, seems like it's safer than a lot of the other options available. And so to the extent that then you're losing the effectiveness of that herbicide, it seems like a real worry over time. But I think it relates to these general worries about industrial agriculture that, you know, if we could find more sort of environmentally or ecologically friendly ways of, you know, of engaging in our agricultural production, that might be better. And these or herbicide resistant crops don't seem to be helping us down that path, I think would be the worries some people might raise. But happy to hear more from Dr. Wu.
Thank you, Dr. Elliott. I only have this point to add, which is the whole idea of selection pressure as a role in driving resistance. We see this with antibiotics. We see this with pesticides and herbicides. The more of it there is in the environment, the more likely that the target, either the insects or the bacteria or the weeds, are going to evolve resistance. They have to, because they're on a treadmill to survive, just as we are on a treadmill to control them. So the real danger is how much is being applied in the environment, whether we're talking about antibiotics or herbicides or pesticides. That's just something to consider for sustainability purposes.
Absolutely, this is a really good point. And I think you have already, Dr. Wu, mentioned the persistence of some of the chemicals in the environment or in the kernels. Now, for the glyphosate, I believe one of the main uses is at the very end of the growth period to spray the entire field to make sure an even maturation of the crop, which means the glyphosate will end up in the food chain at a significant amount. And I believe that some tests have shown glyphosate showing up in flour, in grains. And this is, I believe, really a major concern.
You know, I've heard about that worry, Dr. Hamburger, but I don't consider myself much of an expert on that. So I should probably defer to others, but I do think that's a relevant worry. Looks like we've got somebody who can tell us more.
Hi, I'm Dave Douches, and I'm just jumping in here. First thing I want to say is I wasn't commenting on God earlier. I was commenting that your Elliott's voice was going in and out. I was just concurring with Adrian. So,
Oh, okay.
so just to clarify that, but I'm in the plant soil microbial sciences department. I am not a herbicide specialist. I'm a potato breeder, but I do interact with my weed scientists or whatever, and the concept of actually using Roundup at the end of the season to dry down the crop is not very frequent. The farmers usually rely on the crop maturity and take it into the fall. So I think it would be a very specialized case of them applying Roundup late in the season. I can double check that with my colleagues, but I've never really felt that that's a common practice. Just to,
I would agree.
yeah, I will also add from a BT perspective that microbial applications, as a spray, are nowhere near as effective as a BT crop. The BT crops have been optimized, and they get much better control. Farmers have really not used the BT sprays because they have a limited efficacy. They have a short life on the plant, and the insects and you have to time it really well to have an effective use from that spray. And then I'm just going to add one thing that was not discussed, is that I see the acceptance of GM crops in many cases limited by trade barriers. There's actually a lot of people in the potato world that are supportive of the technology, but because of the European trade barriers, anything that has an international market just takes a GM crop almost off commercialization.
If I could just add something to David's or Dr. Dusha's comments. I actually worked for an agribusiness at the time that Monsanto was introducing the BT crops. And I recall thinking that this was a waste of time because BT didn't work. And that was because I was aware of its use as a spray by the organic lobby. Of course, when it's incorporated into a crop, it only affects those insects that feed on the crop. And that's what makes it so selective and effective.
So thanks for those excellent comments. Please keep posting questions or unmute if you have more questions. Now, there's one other aspect I would like to bring up, and that's what Dr. Wu had in her slides, specifically saying that GMOs are plants or organisms that are generated by humans. And I have not seen this definition before, because I'm aware of one specific case of the sweet potato, apparently during the time of cultivation, which dates back about 10,000 years. There must have been an incident with agrobacteria, because in the modern sweet potato genome, you can find this natural occurring GMO. But at the time of publication, no one really tried to highlight that we are eating a GMO already for 10,000s of years.
Dr. Homburger, you bring up a point that I've heard quite frequently throughout my 20 plus years of working in this area, that sometimes people say, well, we've been genetically modifying plants for 10,000 years, which, depending on how you define it, is somewhat true. In Mesoamerica, the grass teosinte has been modified over the course of generations and generations and hundreds and thousands of years to modern day Zea mays subspecies maize, the corn as we know it. But it started out as this grass, and you just marvel at the ingenuity of somebody looking at it and saying, oh, I'm going to do something with this to make it tasty, to make it productive, to make it beneficial for human consumption. And it is true that ever since the dawn of agriculture, we have been modifying plants and animals for our purposes. I think that there may be several different definitions of GMOs, the ones that I've heard and the one that sometimes that we used, like when I was working at EPA, for example, was very specific to the notion of humans deliberately introducing genes from other species into a host plant.
Now, introducing new traits into host plants, Dr. Wu, you had a point regarding gene flow. And this is actually, this is a question for both of you and Dr. Elliott. Interesting scenario in a lawsuit of Bomo versus, I believe it was Monsanto, this farmer had used on his crops, I believe these were soybeans, glyphosate, and he discovered, yes, there had been gene flow, or there had been soybeans in the hopper where he bought his soybeans from. Now, he then harvested specifically these soybeans and reused them in the next year, and that got him into legal trouble. Do you want to comment on that? Because I believe that our crops may to some extent already be contaminated with GMO seeds.
Yeah, others can probably speak more to the details of that case. I think you might be referring to the case of Percy Schmeiser in Canada. And I know that's a really controversial case. A lot of the facts are complex about the, sort of his claims about what he did versus the evidence about what he may have actually done. I think in general, it illustrates the broader issue of these issues associated with intellectual property and how to think about their pros and cons and the effects on farmers and how the companies end up approaching enforcing their intellectual property control. Dr. Wu, do you want to say more about that?
Oh, I don't know quite a great deal about that, but of course, Percy Schmeiser's name immediately came to mind when Dr. Hamburger started talking as well. He was a Canadian farmer of canola, and Canada has approved Roundup Ready canola for use. So I think that was the example that you were using, in that he had what he had stated was that scouts from Monsanto had gone into his field and found that there was transgenic canola growing, although he himself had not purchased it. I understand that there is some controversy that some are not entirely certain whether, whether all of this is true or not. But it's certainly, I mean, gene flow is something that we can't really control very well. So
if I could comment, I have read about this case over a long time, and I think ultimately it ended up in the highest court in Canada, and Percy Schmeiser was found to be fabricating the evidence. I think he claimed at one time that seeds had fallen off the back of a lorry going past or a truck going past his fields. If that happens, they don't generally end up in nicely cultivated rows, which I believe was what they were. So, and about the intellectual property issue, I mean, forgetting about this particular issue, intellectual property, of course, is important. And when we buy software, for example, from Microsoft, we don't expect to be able to multiply it without, we have to buy another copy or so on. Everybody has to, because the companies need to get a response or a reward for their investment, which is extensive. And the problem with seeds is that they multiply. So that means that in certain contexts, the technology owners charge a fee. But this is not only about GMOs. They do it also for hybrid maize seed, for example, corn seed, because they get the farmer gets a benefit of hybrid vigor from the F1 seed, and it takes skill to breed that seed. Farmers are perfectly at liberty to save a hybrid corn seed and plant the daughter seed, but they find it not in their interests because it's less profitable. So it's an interesting area, but and incidentally on the same thing, I think that ISA, who do a really good job of tracking what's going on with GMOs around the world, have published data, and there's a series of publications by Barfoot, I think the principal author is, showing that most retained profit from GMO seeds is now in the hands of the farmers, not in the hands of the technology companies. So there's a share of that seed. And we also have to remember that farmers are not stupid. They only buy things that they find are useful and interesting to them, whether it's economically or labor saving or whatever other use. So I think those are interesting points as well. And I've enjoyed both of your presentations, by the way.
Thank you,
Thank
Dr.
you for
Wu.
your
I'm
input.
glad you could join us.
Excellent comment. We do have one more question in the chat from Megan Dean. Megan, do you want to speak up, or should I just read it out loud?
Sure, I can read it. Thank you both for a really interesting conversation. So I recently read this paper by Victoria Davion, which I thought brought some interesting and new to me critiques up of GMOs. And so I was just wondering what you all thought about this one, but it's basically just something that often comes up in food justice literature is this idea that most of the problems we have in the food system are not because of a lack of production of food. We have enough food, we have enough good food, nutritious food, but we just don't distribute it well. And the problem is that there is a lot of injustice in how food gets distributed. And some of what GMOs try to do is address those problems like nutritional deficiencies linked to poverty or famine. But if it's the same sort of food system that creates these injustices in distribution that is tasked with distributing the GMOs, why should we trust that the GMOs will actually go to the people who need them or actually be used to, address or correct for these problems with distribution rather than say, just go to increase the profits of certain corporations. And I thought that probably what you've both been saying about taking each GMO as its own case is where you would want to go with that. A response to that, because I do think like food system gets used as like a boogeyman term in some ways in some of this literature. But so I was just curious what you both thought about that.
Dr. Elliott, are you fine if I just say a few words and then?
By all means, and then I have some thoughts too, but please go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Well, it's great to see you, Dr. Dean. There seem to be several points in the issues that you raised that this author had brought up. One has to do with the notion of at least my response is don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We definitely have food distribution problems in the world. That does not necessarily mean that we can't try to come up with solutions while we are fixing the larger problems. I think one of the points that Dr. Elliott had brought up earlier was that many people are concerned about a techno fix, like somehow adding something to food to make it more nutritious. And is that a problem in some ways? And I would point out that since the 1990s, we have been biofortifying cereals and bread and other grains with folic acid because there is a deficiency of folate around the world. And that has led to many fewer babies being born with neural tube defects because folate is crucial for the formation of the neural tube in the first trimester of pregnancy. And I don't think anybody would argue that it was a bad thing that we added folate to food. Another example is that in 2001, the World Health Organization was making a determination about whether to add iodine to salt all around the world because many populations of the world are iodine deficient. And there were some who had objections even to that, but I think it's generally considered now that iodizing salt is a good thing because it helps to prevent the condition goiter in many iodine deficient populations around the world. So while there are, of course, these broad systemic issues that we do need to try to come up with solutions to, but that shouldn't prevent us from trying to prevent disease and other conditions in the meantime. I think that there's always room for that. And just briefly on another point that you had raised about the distribution systems, if these healthful foods, for example, leafy green vegetables and orange vegetables are not getting to the people, how can the seeds get to people? Just one quick observation is that the supply chains are slightly different. Supply chains for food versus supply chains for seed. And I think that in the case of certain fresh vegetables, particularly leafy green vegetables, there are all kinds of issues as far as distributional issues, the refrigeration, sufficiently dry store. There's just all these different issues. And so I don't think that all supply chains can be considered as a monolith. I think there are some people participating in the audience who know supply chains far better than I do, but I would just point out that they are different supply chains. So there's slightly different problems to tackle. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Dr. Wu covered that really well. The one thing I would just say, elaborating on that issue with the supply chains, is, and you kind of anticipated what we would say, Dr. Dean, with the point about thinking about different cases. I really appreciate Victoria Davion's point about thinking about the social context and thinking not just about the technologies, but about the issues of power and sort of how things are being distributed and so on. But I think here's my opportunity to sort of help out the sort of pro golden rice side. I think they would say, even if, say, people aren't getting sort of just access to the leafy green vegetables and so on, a lot of these really not well-off people are getting access to rice. And so the thought would be, well, if you make the rice that they have access to, basically, if you make it golden rice, like this, Dr. Wu was saying, with fortifying things and so on, maybe it is plausible that they would have access at least to rice in contrast to the leafy green. So that's kind of the same point that Dr. Wu is making, but just in that particular case, it might seem plausible that even with all the social problems we have, that people would have access to the golden rice, that they wouldn't have access to other things.
I'm sorry to make another comment. On golden rice, the seed is available to farmers without cost at the same price as white rice by agreements that we put in place with all the governments years ago. And farmers are free to do with it what they wish, to keep it and resow it, or to sell it to their neighbors, or to sell it as grain, as food. Most rice is actually consumed close to where it's grown. And the rice, the homozygous rice, will breed true, so that the next generation is also golden. So, and as rice is the staple in the countries which we're talking about, I mean, people in Asia can eat something like 80% of their calories maybe come from rice, and they may eat 175 kilos a year. And it's cheap. And when populations are under pressure, as they are with COVID at the moment, for example, they go for the cheaper food because they can't even, they haven't got any income, they can't get to any shops. People have sometimes said to me, why don't they eat carrots? Well, carrots don't grow very well in those climates, and there aren't any veggie shops around the corner. So there's a completely different situation. And some of the countries have made tremendous progress during the time that we have been developing golden rice. The Philippines, for example, has made tremendous progress, but Bangladesh almost hasn't, and India hasn't. They have still tremendous problems with children going blind and dying as a result of vitamin A deficiency. And I quite agree with both the speakers. We shouldn't just punish the people who are living now while we're trying to resolve poverty. This is a different issue. This is trying to help the ones that are suffering from poverty. Thank you.
Would it be possible, we have such a great opportunity with Dr. DeVock here, would it be possible for me to ask him a question? I don't know if that's turning the tables, but
I think I've got to go now.
Dr. DeVock is participating from Switzerland, so.
I was just curious if Dr. Hamburger says it's okay. Is that all right? Because sometimes, people will raise some of the critics will say, you've got so many different rice varieties in different, parts of the world that have these different characteristics that, people value or that are good for growing in different contexts. I was just curious how well you think that the progress of golden rice is going in terms of, sort of moving this gene trait into the array of different kinds of rices grown here and there and so on, how you would respond to those sort of concerns about the local varieties and context.
It's a good question, Kevin, if I may call you Kevin. I'm used to being informal over here.
Yeah, please do.
I'm Adrian. So,
great.
The issue, there are about 20,000 varieties of rice, and of course there is not one golden rice. Golden rice is the traits that produce the beta carotene introduced into any locally agronomically adapted and preferred by the local population rice. it doesn't really affect, and if there was a problem of gene flow, I mean, actually pollen from rice, it's self-pollinating inside the flower, and outside the flower of rice, pollen only lasts for a very short period of time. And if gene flow was a problem, I can't imagine there would be 20,000 varieties of rice. There'd be one variety of rice because the pollen would have, you know, from all those varieties would have mixed up. So I don't know whether that answers your question, but you ask about progress. The main problem we have is that the people who have created such concern about GMO crops, starting with the Cartagena Protocol, even before the Cartagena Protocol, probably in the 1970s, that set of concerns, which have been overcome for food enzymes, for pharmaceuticals, even for the vaccines, which I had my first shot today of the Moderna vaccine, you know, against COVID. All of those things have been produced using GMOs. But for agriculture, food is such an emotional subject that concerns were raised and have been very successfully exploited by activist groups for various, what I might call commercial reasons, fundraising or to promote a particular anti-corporate agenda, that there's a lot of suspicion around there. And what's holding things up in Bangladesh at the moment, for example, is the Environment Ministry not wishing to make a decision. But there's no, how can there be a problem? There isn't a problem with golden rice for the environment. But beta carotene is in all other parts of the rice crop, apart from the grain, naturally, and is ubiquitous in the environment as well, and in a balanced diet of everything, including what's in the environment. So it's hung up for suspicion, and it's extremely sad because we could be saving lives and could have been saving lives for probably the last 10 years, and yet that hasn't happened yet. So we're hoping that it will. We're waiting on particularly two regulatory decisions, one in Bangladesh and one in the Philippines. They've had all the data they've requested. In the case of Bangladesh, provided in November 2017. And we're now in 2021 and they haven't taken a decision. It's very frustrating.
I see David, it looks like might be. But you're muted, sorry.
I'd like to concur what Adrian is saying. We have a USAID project in Bangladesh and Indonesia. And so we've been following the golden rice, and we see how the environment, exactly what he's saying, the environmental ministry is holding up the product. There's a very complex regulatory system there that's kind of, it really makes it very difficult to get the approval. And so it's really opportunity lost, from my opinion. One of the things I just want to say about Bangladesh is that the experience of working there is, just to put it in context between Bangladesh and the United States. Bangladesh actually has a land mass just about equivalent to Michigan. And we have almost 10 million people. Bangladesh has 165 million people. So that amount of people is living on the same amount of land as us and having to feed themselves. And so we're trying to, improve potato production with disease-resistant potatoes, because if we can improve production, we can reduce the amount of acreage that is going to growing the crop. It's the stress on the land is amazing. They're growing 3 crops a year on some of the land just so that they can feed the people. It's just something that we're not really aware of here in the United States on how much population pressure they have. So
what's very interesting, David, you know more about this than I do, I expect, but in Bangladesh, they have introduced BT aubergine several years ago, and extremely successfully. Smallholder farmers are getting whacking great crops of aubergine, which is a smallholder crop there, and using much less pesticide, and everybody's happy. So it's not as if they don't have any experience of BT crops, of GM crops.
Yeah, you're right. So just for everybody else's sake, he's talking about eggplants. So the BT eggplant. And what's really actually limiting the distribution to more farmers is actually having it distributed in or moved into different varieties. It's only in like 4 different varieties right now, and they need to expand that. And so it just takes time.
I think that there's a point, Dave, that you brought up earlier that we didn't really address, and that's the whole notion of the precautionary principle in regulation. And that has been explicitly used in order to ban the approval of GMOs, I guess, for the last 25 or so years in some parts of the world, including the European Union. This notion that where there's the possibility of some risk, precautionary measures must be taken. And there sometimes is a proviso that you have to justify it scientifically, but that's not always there. And that's not always held up. It's just, you can't prove to me that there's no risk, therefore, we're not going to allow this. And so the precautionary principle has been a notion that's also been defined somewhat differently depending on the regulatory body, but it has been a significant force in preventing GMOs from being more widespread around the world.
I hate to interrupt at this point, and it's perfectly fine if we keep going on, but the official time for the Brews and Views will be at 4:30. So maybe if our 2 excellent speakers have a few concluding remarks, and then we can stay on if more discussion comes up.
Would you like
Sure.
to go first, Kevin?
Yeah, sure. I guess I can. And yeah, happy to talk further with others. It'd be great to hear others' insights. It's fun to get some of the input we've gotten during this conversation. Maybe I guess before I offer concluding thoughts, I really appreciate your bringing up the issue of the precautionary principle, because I do think it's a really interesting issue where in a sense, we're all precautionary about certain things, but we have to weigh these issues of, what risks are so serious and so significant that we're willing to take significant precautionary action to prevent. And, we have to recognize that there are always costs of taking these precautionary actions. We may be missing out on opportunities. And so, one has to sort of weigh those issues of, how significant are the risks and how precautionary is one willing to be. And one can often take different sorts of precautionary measures. A very moderate sort of precautionary measure might just be, well, we better collect some more information about this, or we better monitor as we implement some activity. Often when we think about the precautionary principle, it's just banning an activity, saying, well, because we're afraid of this, we're not going to do this at all. And I think there are a variety of ways in which one can be precautionary without being so black and white and not being able to take advantage of new technological opportunities. So thank you so much for bringing that up. I guess maybe the last thing I would say that I don't think we've gotten to talk about so much is just the opportunities to perhaps implement GMOs in ways that might alleviate some of the concerns that are often raised. So I think it's really exciting. I mean, it'd be fun to hear more about David's work, in Bangladesh and so on, and Adrian's work. I think it's really exciting to think about ways in which those developing these crops can work more closely with the communities that are actually going to be using them. Because I think sometimes the criticism is that, you've got scientists developing some crop, but may not know enough about the details of the local context in which they're actually going to be used. And so, I'm not an expert on these kinds of development practices, but I think that's interesting. And then I was setting a bit of a contrast between sort of industrial agriculture, with GMOs versus more new environmentally friendly approaches. And, my last comment might be, it might be fun to look at ways to sort of lessen that dichotomy. So, for example, others probably know a lot more than I do about the Land Institute, but it's a really interesting place in Kansas where they're trying to develop perennial crops where there could be various benefits associated with, sort of maintaining soil quality from these kinds of crops. They might need less irrigation and so on. And I think they use a mixture of more traditional plant breeding methods and some genetic modification. And so, you know, I think we can sometimes be using new GM technologies to, you know, sort of further some really new, interesting, innovative strategies sometimes. And so I think, anyway, there are a lot of ways of using GMOs, and I just wanted to highlight some of those interesting possibilities. So I'll be quiet and turn it over to Felicia.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elliott, Dr. Hamburger, and everyone for participating. It's been really fantastic to be a part of this. I think that my only concluding remark is that we tend to think in monoliths, much to our detriment in some cases. That GMOs have been all put under a same umbrella, and the point that Dr. Elliott and I have been attempting to make in the last hour and a half is that they really need to be decided on a case-by-case basis. Because if you think about some of the objections that are raised, they do not apply to all GMOs. For example, not all genetically modified crops are under the control of biotech giants that are going to try to milk farmers. Some are indeed in the hands of, for example, the Golden Rice Humanitarian Board. Some are in the public domain, so that's not always a concern. In some cases, there are problems of the evolution of resistance. With others, there's not that much of a concern. Each type of genetically modified crop, indeed every type of genetically modified organism, needs to be considered on a case-by-case basis. Indeed, I would say that doing so actually helps us even in our risk assessments as well, let alone benefits assessment, that we would say for this particular case, we think that these particular risks might occur. And I think that that's a much more rational way to think about these crops. I was trying to come up with an analogy of how we use certain processes, but with vastly different results. And I'm sure that all of you can think of examples of that. And I think that that's how we also have to think about GMOs in general, and not under one umbrella, either to wholly approve or to wholly disapprove. Thank you.
Fantastic. It's been such a pleasure talking with both of you. Super exciting topic. And I think that today we have really cast some light on the very different facets this has. And in the end, I believe that it looks like the evil is not really in GMOs. The evil may be in the activists, in governments blocking regulations, helping people. So with that, I would like really to thank both of you. This has been fantastic, very interesting, and I'm looking forward to the next Brews and Views.